First of all, I noticed people having a few beers. Toilet location is in the back of the room over there, so you can creep out there at a later stage. Please put your mobiles on silent. The kitchen is only open till 8:30, so if you're expecting a meal after the meeting, unless we run short, I don't think you're going to get anything. So unfortunately we couldn't keep it open, we did ask. Please put your email address down on a sheet as it goes around. You're probably aware that Coal Free Southern Highlands is the successor to the Southern Highlands Coal Action Group. We used to have a database of 5,000 people, but when we put that company into voluntary liquidation, we had to give up our database. So we're rebuilding it as we speak, so please put your email addresses down. And I know you've probably put them down for Battle for Berrimah, that's great, but put them down on our list as well, because we've got stuff that's going out all the time too. Now, talking about Battle for Berrimah, they're having they'll be at Burradoo on Saturday, August the 20th, and a special information kiosk at Apex Oval in Burradoo. So please drop by. They've produced a really good flyer about the project, so you can learn more about the project generally if you want to drop into Battle for Berrimah's kiosk. So at that point, I'd like to welcome Larry Whipper, the Mayor of Wingecarribee, to welcome to country for us. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Peter. Before we start tonight, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on, the Gundungurra people, and to pay respects to elders past, present and future. I'd also like to remind everybody here tonight that the land we are standing on is, and always will be, the traditional and spiritual land of the Gundungurra people. So I'd like to, if I could, welcome Ron and Tim tonight and thank, what do we call him, Coal Free Southern Highlands these days, for sponsoring this evening. This is something that's very passionate and dear to our hearts. As you know, Council have got a position, certainly a majority position, and we've been very solid in that. We really believe that mining is a threat to the economy of this area, irrespective of now whether we're right or wrong. We're about to find out. So we'll be tested here tonight, and hopefully we'll all get an opportunity as well to ask questions and have those questions answered. But we're very passionate, very consistent in our belief that this area should remain coal-free, and we're doing everything we can to support that. So we thank every one of you that's been in this battle for 6 years plus, and we know we've stood alongside of you for all those years, and we'll do into the future as well. Hopefully it won't be that much longer. So let's get it right. So thank you everybody for being here tonight, and as I say, believe us, we have a position as council. Hopefully after the elections that position will remain the same. So it's up to you to be very mindful in the coming elections of who you can trust and who you can't. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Before I introduce our guests, I'd just like to say a couple of things. Normally the process of trying to obtain approval for a mine involves an environmental impact statement. So the mining company puts forward what could be 4 volumes this high, 2,000 pages of technical assessments, environmental assessments, economic, financial assessments of the project, and they put their best foot forward. The problem with the process, planning department then assesses it and puts it out for a public review, if you like. But normally they only give you between, let's say, 30 and sometimes, as in this case, 60 days to review it. There's an absolute impossibility to assess a project that is going to involve an investment of $1 billion or north of $1 billion in 30 or 60 days. That is a complete nonsense. And, tonight, what you're going to hear is one study from the Australia Institute, which we've commissioned, and I'm going to introduce Tim from Sustainable Southern Highlands, who have funded that study. The study's taken 3 or 4 months to put together, and it's ongoing. It isn't actually complete. We're doing some case studies around the Highlands of businesses that will be influenced by a mine decision, either positively or negatively. And we're front running the planning process. We're saying to the planning department, here's the document, you ask Hume Coal why their mine won't do what our document said. And you all remember the water study? Hume Coal have never been able to answer the water study. We put it on the table 2 years ago. We have had nothing from them, apart from confirmation when they put a submission up to the federal government on for the Environmental Protection Act federally, which confirmed what we had said. The groundwater impacts would be over about 300 square kilometres, and they draw down the water to mine level effectively where the mine is going to be, over a 35-40 square kilometre area. Now, we will continue to table these documents ahead of the planning process because it's the only way this community can have its voice heard, and we can force the other side to step up and actually give us what they believe. Now, they can get on the radio and they can say, oh, this is all rubbish and so on, but the challenge to Hume Coal is to step up, give us their assumptions, we'll put them into these models, tell us why what we're saying is not correct, because these people are industry professionals with high reputations, and they put their necks on the line when they come out with this sort of assessment. So I just wanted to say that in the first instance. The other thing that you're probably aware of, there's a group of landowners in Sutton Forest who've been going through hell for 3 or 4 years fighting for you for this project. And many hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent in legal actions, hearings, arbitrations and so on by a group of landowners in Sutton Forest, supported by a broader group of donors who've provided money. To date, this fight has cost about $2 million, all up. Now that sounds a huge amount of money. Unfortunately, sorry, $2 million has been spent between a group of people. There are people in this room who put their hand in their pocket to the tune of $150,000, not just fighting for their own property, but fighting for you and fighting for the Southern Highlands. And I don't think, these people don't get enough recognition for what they're doing. There's another legal hearing in September. We had a huge win in the Court of Appeal that probably is the checkmate for POSCO or Hume Coal in this district. Won't allow them to get onto any of the properties up and down Goldenvale Road, but we still have to have another court hearing in September to really lock that down, and the other side is throwing all sorts of legal curveballs at us to try to tip a bucket over that judgment. And you cannot imagine what these guys try on. It's underhanded legal tactics. Every angle you can think of, they will throw at us, try to burn up the dollars, try to stop us being successful. But the main message from this group and for all of you, we cannot give in. We will win this battle. Now, the importance of tonight is, in any of these assessments, it's really important that we show the government whether or not a project like this makes economic sense to New South Wales, to the Southern Highlands, and also, funnily enough, to POSCO. Because there's no point building a project if the project will never be built if it doesn't make any sense to the proponent, the person putting it up. And the two gentlemen you have in front of you today will talk to that at great length. Now, at this point, I'd like to introduce Tim Littlemore. Tim's representing Sustainable Southern Highlands, and he can tell their story. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Peter. Sustainable Southern Highlands was set up in October last year with its purpose being to raise funds to handle research applications to do with sustainability in the Highlands. The funding initially came from a wonderful event which was held at Benduli Estate, a dinner where we raised $137,000 after GST. And that has been used, or is being used, to fund all of the activities in terms of research projects which are coming to us. Some have come from coal-free Southern Highlands. We have been approached also by Battle for Berrima, and it's open to anybody to come to us with a proposal. Michael Luskin is our president. He's unfortunately overseas at the moment, otherwise he'd be talking to you. The event that we held last year needs a few thank yous as well. It was organised by Paul Bergelow, Mark Gregg and Michael Yamsley. They put on a fantastic dinner for about 180 people. The Bergelow family provided all the food, all the grog, all the services, everything. The Barnes family, Jimmy and his beautiful and talented children, performed for us, again, free of charge. Alan Jones did one of his amazing lectures, and as usual, Alan doesn't charge for anything that he does for us, and he's been incredibly helpful. The reason for doing it is because we wanted to set up an organisation that could be apart from those doing the hard yards, something that could be relieving them of some of the pressures of raising money. And we've been very successful in doing that thanks to people like the Bergelow family and all of the people who worked on that particular event. We will be having more events. Anybody who wants to help with funding of that sort of thing, we are a not-for-profit organisation. It's called Sustainable Southern Highlands Incorporated. None of the people involved take any funds from anything, and if we have external activities, the directors just pay for those and we keep going, as is the case with so much of the work being done here. So, on behalf of Sustainable Southern Highlands, it's a thrill to see the first two reports being issued tonight, and there are 3 more that are being worked on at the moment, and we continue to seek or open ourselves up for anybody who's got a good project, a good idea, whether it's to do with heritage or business or air quality, because most of the work so far has been done concerning water and the impact of that, plus the business. So again, thank you, Peter, for the opportunity of being involved, and on behalf of Sustainable Southern Highlands, I hope you all really get the message and can pass it on to as many people as you can tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. At this point, I'd like to introduce Rod Campbell from the Australia Institute in Canberra. I should say, we commissioned Rod's report. Tim's group, IEFA, the Institute of Energy, I always forget, Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. It's a global organisation. They've actually funded their work themselves. They put out work around the world on coal mining and energy projects, and they've been good enough to run the pencil over this particular project. But without further ado, I'd like to mention Rod. Before I do, one thing. We just heard that the New South Wales government has bought out the mining lease or the exploration licence from BHP up in the Liverpool Plains, Karuna, $220 or $250 million, which Tim can talk about whether that makes sense to spend that money. That sets a hell of a precedent for a lot of these other projects, which really are very questionable. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rod.
Thanks very much, Peter. My name's Rod Campbell. I'm an economist at the Australia Institute in Canberra. We're a not-for-profit think tank. We're funded by donations and occasionally bits of commissioned work. And let me say what a thrill it is to be out on a cold Thursday night as an economist and have such a crowd here in front of me. Most economists like living in Canberra, where there's lots of us and lots of people who like talking about economics. But I think I'm going to tell them that we had a crowd of a couple of hundred people in the Southern Highlands out to talk about cost-benefit analysis of coal on a Thursday night, and I think a few people might be moving up here. Because like most economists, I spend a lot of time looking at a computer and playing with spreadsheets, and it's a fairly lonely occupation at times. And so when you get an opportunity to actually talk to people and actually see people who are affected by the projects and policies that we talk about, it's an opportunity to be grabbed with both hands. And the fact that Peter said I'm allowed to speak at great length and nobody went for the doors at that point, which you can lock now, is good news. So like most economists, I'd really rather be telling jokes. Are there any economists in the house tonight? Okay, sorry about that. Well, how many economists does it take to wallpaper a room? It depends how thinly you can slice them. Boom, boom. So I was leading a quiet and prosperous life as an economist in Melbourne until a few years ago, and I got a phone call from a farmer not far from the Liverpool Plains, actually, up near Narrabri, and he asked if I'd be prepared to look at the economic modelling of the Maules Creek coal project, because the Maules Creek Community Council didn't quite understand how that project was going to make more jobs than there were people in the village, and they suspected that the economic modelling that had been used by the coal company might not stand up to scrutiny. And it certainly didn't. I had a look, I made a big submission for them. That did go quite well, at least in the planning process. And so there began a process that's been now going for 5 years of working with community groups, looking at economic modelling of coal projects in particular, but of economic assessment more widely. I ended up in a big court case in the Hunter Valley looking at the Warkworth coal project, where Rio Tinto had used an economic model to claim that their project was going to make 45,000 jobs out of a mine that only employed 1,000 people. And as some of you may know, the judge believed me and the Australia Institute that was absolute nonsense. And so I think what you start to get a feel from, certainly I have over the last 5 years, is that economic assessment is far from an objective science. Commissioned economic assessment tends to find the results that the people commissioning it want to find. And so I encourage, and the Australia Institute spends a fair bit of time trying to explain economics in accessible terms. Because economics isn't rocket science, and if something sounds a bit funny, if something sounds not quite right or too good to be true, it probably is. And all the Greek letters and equations and graphs in the world shouldn't be used to obscure what are usually pretty common sense things. Economics should be about common sense and explaining things and helping people participate in project and policy processes. But unfortunately, and I don't know if my fellow economists would agree, too many economists have become guns for hire. We don't have a professional body or a code of conduct. You know, you can't put a sign out the front of your house saying, "I'm a doctor, come in here and I'll heal you." But you can put a sign out saying, "I'm an economist, I'll come up with the economic model you like." There's nothing to stop anyone doing that. We're not a regulated profession, and so be wary of economists of all persuasions. So without further ado, you know, let's get into the good stuff. Let's talk about some economics. Yeah. That's all. I don't get to do this very often. I'm going to cost-benefit analysis of a coal project is sort of what it sounds like. You add up the costs in terms of what it might cost financially. You add up the benefits of what you might get from selling the coal. But importantly, an economist should also include costs to other people, other businesses, to the environment and society. This isn't some crazy Canberra think tank economics. This is textbook economics, and importantly, it's the economics of the New South Wales guidelines for assessment of coal and coal seam gas projects, which I've had a fair bit to do with rewriting over the last few years. And that's another process that is ongoing, and this study is certainly making a contribution to that. So, cost-benefit analysis of a coal mine. Let's have a look at some costs and some benefits. So, how much coal are we going to dig up? So that's fairly uncontroversial. And again, I say never be confused or impressed or astonished with graphs and figures. They should all make sense. And if they don't, put up your hand later and we can talk about them. But so our assessment is based on some economic modelling, but key to that is how much coal is going to be dug up. And you can see here the blue line shows how much coal Hume is planning to dig up. The orange line is what they call run-of-mine coal, the coal that comes out of the ground, but it still needs some processing and cleaning, and so it comes down to the blue line. And so that's about how much Hume are planning to sell. And so I've got sources in most of these things. If you can't read them or you're curious about them, come and talk to me later. But this is from the preliminary environmental assessment of the project. So essentially that's Hume's own plan for how much coal they'll dig up and sell and when. So if you're working out your benefits in your cost-benefit analysis, you've got your quantity of coal, but you've really got to think about how much are you going to sell it for. And coal prices have obviously been a big deal in recent years, or they're a lot smaller deal than they used to be. But before you can work out how much you might be able to sell your coal for, you've got to know a bit about it. Coal ain't just coal, its quality actually matters. And I've seen in some of the information or maybe not information I've seen, there's been a lot of emphasis put on the fact that this mine, it's a metallurgical coal mine, so it's apparently a high quality of coal. All these details are in the report, so don't feel that you need to see the exact numbers now. But what's in the report is you can compare the benchmark standards for what's in coal to what the New South Wales government has published for what they think will come out of the Hume Coal project. And so you've got things like how much moisture is in the coal, how much ash or sand and grit is in it, how volatile it is. And an important thing for coking coal is how much it might swell up when it's heated, how much energy is in it. If you sort of look down here, you can see that in terms of moisture, Hume's coal is looking pretty good. In terms of ash, that's a bit of a bad thing. You want that number to be smaller than 11. In fact, you want it to be under 9. Volatile material is a lot higher than what you want there. So is sulfur. Energy is a little bit low, and the swelling's a bit low too. So yes, this is metallurgical coal. That is important to notice. It does sell for more than thermal coal, so some of the benchmark prices you might see in the news aren't entirely relevant. Well, they're not exactly what they're talking about, but this is not high-grade coal. This is not the good stuff that they're pulling out of the Bowen Basin in Queensland, which it really is world-class hard coking coal. That's not really what we're looking at. And so we've based our price assessments more or less on what the Australian Commonwealth Treasury's long-term price forecasts are. You can see the orange line, there's a years along the bottom, financial year. The orange line is the benchmark, the slightly higher quality coking coal price. The blue line is the thermal coal price, so coal that's not used to make steel, but coal that's used just to chuck in a power station and generate electricity. And so based on the quality of the coal and the amount of steel making and thermal coal that's used, that's likely to come out of what the government says will come out of the ground in Hume, we're basing our assessment on the dotted line down there. So a little bit below the benchmark coking coal price, but a fair way above some of the prices you're seeing there. A lot of the prices you see in the news related to thermal coal. So I would argue that we're being fairly generous there. Tim may disagree, or Hume may disagree, but I think we're certainly in the ballpark as far as Commonwealth Treasury are concerned. So that's how much coal we're going to dig up and what we think we might be able to sell it for. Let's turn now to how much it might cost to pull it out of the ground. And this is a big deal, I think, for this project, which is a relatively small project. It's new, it doesn't already exist, so it needs a lot of capital expenditure, a lot of new money. And from what I understand, it's a very complicated geology around here. There's obviously a lot of issues around groundwater that everyone's very concerned about. And partly as a result of that, some of the techniques that are being proposed involve leaving a lot of coal in the ground. And that might be good for the geology and hydrogeology. I'm not an expert in that. But it is very expensive. There's very few examples of this kind of mining technique being used, and so we don't know a lot about exactly how much it's going to cost, but it can't be terribly cheap, otherwise everyone would be using it, and they're not. So to assess how much it might cost, and I think that's important, this isn't a technique that's used very often. I've looked at a lot of coal mines in the last 5 years. I've been an expert witness in court cases, I've been to more planning hearings than you can count. I've never seen anyone proposing to do this. And if it was cheap, I would have seen it by now, because I've seen some pretty cheap and nasty coal proposals. So we've gone into a bit of detail in the report about what we think it might cost per tonne to extract coal out of the ground from around here. And we've done it by looking at other mines that we think are similar in some way. The top one's actually a mine in Queensland, but it's a very similar size and similar stage of development. The bottom one here is the Illawarra met coal mine, which we put in there because it's close to here, although it's at, and so it faces a lot of similar costs. You have to pay people similar amounts of money, likely to pay similar amounts for machinery, but it has been operating for a long time, so is facing a few different aspects of what it costs to run a mine. And so we think the Hume coal mine will run somewhere in between those two, and so we think at about $97 per tonne on average over the project, although that obviously changes at different times. So I think it's important to kind of understand, if we're in the ballpark here at $97 a tonne, let's just have a look at how that compares to other met coal, other steel-making coal mines in Australia. And it doesn't compare very well. is the news there. This is what they call a cost curve for steel making coal in Australia. And it's come from industry analysts, and we've done a few tweaks to update it, but I'm happy to talk to anyone who's really interested in that. So what it means is, across the bottom is how many million tonnes in Australia can be produced at different prices. So the first 10 million tonnes of coking coal in Australia can be produced at a tick over $60 a tonne. Then each one of these little increments is another mine, and you get higher and higher at more and more dollars a tonne. Here where it's at $80 a tonne, and here's Bellevue at $91 a tonne. Here's Hume at 97, and here are the really expensive mines in Australia, which are likely to be the first to close down because they're the most expensive to run, although it depends on all sorts of other things, of course. And so, if you're starting a new mine, you really don't want it to be, usually you mine the easy to get, the cheap stuff first. And so if you're starting a new mine, you really want it to be one of the cheap ones. You don't want to start a mine that's already one of the expensive ones in Australia. That just seems crazy to most economists, but we'll talk a bit more later about why you might chase a project that seems to make no economic sense. This is just a bit of context in terms of our cost-benefit analysis. The benefits we've talked about of how much coal to dig up and how much one might be able to sell it for. These are the costs, and it's a costly mine, it's an expensive mine, just in terms of what it's going to cost the company. And so here are our initial estimates of revenues and costs. And it comes out, if we're in the ballpark at $97 a tonne to produce, and average coal price, I think it's $112.50, it was $115. And you multiply it all through, this is what you come out with, negative $368 million. And if you, economists like to do something that we call discounting, of rather than just add things up and get the benefits and minus the costs, we like to look at what year they are and how far in the future do they occur. And things that occur a long way in the future, we like to put a discount on, make it seem cheaper. Because when you think about it, would you rather I gave you $100 today or $100 in 10 years' time? Who would prefer $100 today? Most people. Who would prefer $100 in 10 years' time? Very, very good point. We'll come back to that. What if the choice became $100 today or $200 in 3 years' time? $100 today? It's kind of a tougher choice, isn't it? Because we discount the future. You might not be able to find me in 3 years' time. God knows where I might be. I might not have the money anymore. So economists like to discount both random strangers offering you $100 in 3 years' time, but we also discount costs in the future as well. And so at a rate of 7%, which is what New South Wales Planning does most of its assessments at, we think at that rate, the project would be worth about negative $400 million. And that's in terms of just its operations. We're not really looking at wider water or social costs or benefits at this stage. These numbers will be slightly different to what Tim's talking about. This is where might be interesting to talk about the difference between a financial assessment and an economic assessment. Finance people and economics people have a lot of the same skills, but we're just interested in slightly different things. Finance people are usually interested in how much will this return to shareholders. So, when you pick up the financial review, they're usually talking about share dividends and tax rates and and profits and losses, whereas economists are less interested in what the company might borrow money at and rates like that. We're not preparing anything to go to shareholders. We're really looking at what costs and benefits go into an economy-wide assessment that a government or a planning process might be interested in. And so we look at discount rates and interest rates and depreciation, amortization in a bit of a different way to the way Tim would look at it. So that's why some of our numbers will be a little bit different. Anyway, if our costs and benefits are even in the ballpark, and as they're based mainly on Hume's or the government's numbers, we think they can't be too far off, this project is definitely going to lose money and hundreds of millions of dollars of it. Then let's talk about the thing that you all know more about than I do, which is groundwater. So in an economic assessment, you also need to consider what economic value might be put on groundwater. And in some cases, an economist, I think, would legitimately say, I can't put a value on that, but it is an important impact, and I would present that along with whatever financial numbers I've come up with. In our assessment though, we've looked at a few groundwater rights transactions around here, and we've used a sum of $2,000 a megalitre, which I'm told is about right. Happy to talk to people about it later. That's certainly a sum that's used regularly in other assessments of coal mines in New South Wales. The problem, and of course you're probably familiar that the original Southern Highlands Coal Action Group study estimated a range of groundwater impacts, and Hume Coal have also, I believe, put an estimate out themselves of 3.2 gigalitres. The other studies went up to 21.2. In our assessment, we've used a mid-range of 9.7, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail later. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty around this, and I'm not a groundwater expert, so I don't have a strong opinion on what's the right value to be using there. We've gone with that because it seems to be in the middle. And we've also done some what we call sensitivity testing around what would happen if different values turn out to be correct. And so what we think the uncertainty is somewhere between impacts worth about $11 million and $235 million. So that's a huge amount of uncertainty. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of potential impacts on your water and your economy and your businesses here. And to an economist, that's kind of why you're all upset, or a lot of people are upset, is because there are potentially hundreds of millions of dollars worth of impacts, and no one's quite sure who's going to wear that. And obviously that's a difficult thing for an economist to deal with, all this uncertainty. So we've run the numbers at all sorts of different levels. That's what these ones are looking at the size of the impact, whether it's down at the Hume estimate of 3.2 gigalitres or at the high end of 16. Over here's what the price per megalitre, and the reason why it goes up from the 2,000 I was talking about up to 6,000 is because from my discussions with people here, you might be able to buy water, you might be able to buy a megalitre here for $2,000 today. Maybe you could find somebody willing to sell you that in the room tonight. That might be okay, but from what I understand, the groundwater resource here only has 16 gigalitres of allocation. So buying a couple of megs here and there might be fine, but even if you're coming in as Hume Coal, and Hume Coal are saying we're going to come in here with 3.2 gigalitres impact, 3.2 is about 20% of 16. They're coming in and saying we're going to impact 16%, 20% of the market, of the water market here. You can't go into any market in the world and as a new customer and say, I'm just going to buy 20% of everything here and not expect to push the price up. And there might not be 3.2 gigalitres to be had, except at extraordinary prices. So in those circumstances where potentially at this end, you're coming in and saying, I'm buying the entire groundwater rights here, or at least I should be paying for that, I think a tripling of the price could be quite conservative still. It's a very small resource. There's a lot of people who've invested a lot of money into using that resource, and any mine or any other sort of project that comes in and says, we want to use a whole big bunch of that and we'll pay for it, well, you're really going to have to pay for it. So I think there is huge uncertainty around this value, and there's also uncertainty around the values that come later. What if this works to pollute and affect the quality of ground or surface water? What if it affects biodiversity? What if that affects the ability and willingness of businesses in Berrima to work on the upkeep of their heritage properties? All of these things are aspects that a good economist should look at, and a good economist is required to look at under New South Wales government guidelines. But rather than going into detail on all of those factors, which we do in our lovely report here, I'll even sign the cover for you if you want to later. We can go into all those in a lot more detail. So, taking into account all of these costs, our bottom line is we think this represents an economic loss of $555 million, most of which would be borne by Hume Coal, and probably a couple of $100 million would be borne by all of you. So I certainly don't think that's a very good idea. We'll go here while we're still talking about impacts. Just to change tack a little of what does this mean for the economy of the Southern Highlands? You hear a lot about job creation in different industries, and I've certainly done enough modelling of indirect jobs and things like that to last a lifetime. But what we've got up here, and it's also in the report in more detail, is a graph of what industries employ what percent of the workforce in both New South Wales and the Southern Highlands. And it comes from the 2011 census. We might be waiting a while for an update on that. I was hoping to have it ready by tonight. Not to be. Hilarious jokes at the ABS's expense aside. New South Wales and the Southern Highlands have fairly similar structures of employment. As is the case in most developed economies, healthcare is the biggest employer in either case. And retail and manufacturing, education, construction all come next. It's important to see down here, in both the Southern Highlands and in New South Wales, is mining. Mining employs less than 1% of the New South Wales workforce, less than 1, I think it's less than 1, yeah, it must be less than 1% of the Southern Highlands workforce, and this was 5 years ago. Berwick Colliery, I think, was still operating. I think Tarmore was doing better. Illawarra mines were doing better. You know, even at that better time, mining only ever employed 1% of the workforce here. Even in the Hunter, the premier coal district of the province of New South Wales, it's 5% of employment. And this is because mining is what we call capital intensive, which means it uses a lot of machinery, a lot of expensive machinery, most of which is imported, although some of it's made here, which is interesting. But mining is capital intensive, it doesn't actually employ very many people. If you really want to create jobs in an economy, you focus your policies on industries that do employ lots of people. You look at providing better healthcare, and what's interesting about the Southern Highlands is some of the service industries that we see that are a lot bigger than New South Wales here. I'm sorry if it's not very clear to look at, but you can see that retail in the Southern Highlands is much higher than New South Wales on average. So is that one, which is accommodation and food services, and so is this one, which is agriculture. And that probably doesn't come as a surprise to anyone here, because there's an awful lot of businesses here that are involved in agriculture, tourism, accommodation, and selling things to tourists. Tourism isn't defined as an industry by the ABS because tourism is made up of lots of different things. Tourists need to be accommodated, they need to be driven around, they need to be fed, all of which are different industries according to the ABS. But the ones that the Southern Highlands are biggest in are the industries that you expect to be associated with tourism, and particularly with agriculture-based tourism. And I imagine this doesn't come as a surprise to anyone here, because you market yourselves as the big agri-tourism destination. And along with the heritage, this is the good food and wine and other nice things around here are really what people come for. All of those things are likely to be negatively affected by a great big coal mine, whereas the sorts of industries that might benefit from coal mines are not really the strengths here. And so, as an economist who advises on not only on cost-benefit analysis, but on wider policy, I would argue that if you're looking to protect and create jobs in the Southern Highlands, then encouraging mining is almost the last possible thing you should be doing. On that note, I might leave that point and just go to my last point, which I don't have a graph for, but I have alluded to, is why on earth would a company pursue a project that doesn't seem to make economic or financial sense? And this gets thrown at me by journalists and coal lobbyists, and disappointingly by government bureaucrats quite regularly. Even by economists, astonishingly. There's all sorts of reasons why once you've bought a project, you're not going to walk away from it. Running a project like this, or getting approval for a project like this, what it brings is the right but not the obligation to actually build the project anytime soon. So it could be approved, but it could then sit there not being built for many, many years. So the couple of hundred people that are hopefully looking forward to a job maybe building the mine might be waiting a long, long time, even though approval is given. And in the meantime, you've got all those tourism and agriculture businesses that have said to me, and some of you are in the room, that you've got plans on hold or cancelled because of the uncertainty around your ordering patterns. So there's a real cost in what I think is probably a likely outcome of planning departments giving approval for projects that then sit there imposing costs on the community, but not providing any sorts of benefits through employment or royalties. Why do you keep pursuing this? Because, as a company, why would you keep pursuing this? Because you're already in there. You've already paid a lot of money, and if you can get it approved, you might be able to sell it to some other sucker. You'll never sell it if it's not approved. So there's one reason you might push for approval. If you also get approval, as I've said, you can sit there and wait till the coal price improves. You never know your luck. But also, and I think this is a really important factor in this case, a third reason before we get to that, if you're a big overseas steelmaking company and you can afford to lose a few $1 million down in somewhere your chief executive has never actually heard of, but it gives you the opportunity of potentially some supply when you need it in a decade's time, that's another sort of corporate strategic reason why you might want the approval of a mine that you have no intention of building at the moment. And you see this throughout the coal industry in Australia. I think also pertinently is you've got a lot of people who have put their own careers on the line into getting this project up. There's people who will be working for Hume Coal, people who are working in the planning department, and people in POSCO who will have advised, yes, we should make this investment, and they have a personal stake in not walking away. Whoever has to explain to the POSCO board or shareholders, hey, what happened to that thing that used to be on our books for worth a couple of $1 million, and now there's a zero there instead? Somebody's got to explain that to a board, and it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good if you're a mining executive and you're known as the guy who never got that Southern Highlands project up. You try going to the Hunter Valley or to Queensland for your next big job as a coal executive, where everyone knows, oh, that's the guy who screwed up the Southern Highlands thing. That was the guy who had Alan Jones ranting about it. Nobody's going to want to touch you when you're in that position. And so there's a lot of people, no, it's not a laughing matter. This is a serious issue for people involved in these projects, and this is not unique. People within the mining industry said to me the reason why Rio Tinto pushed so hard on a lot of the Warkworth project was not because they were desperate for the project, but because a lot of people in there had publicly and commercially put their reputations on the line. There's huge incentive for people within companies, within planning systems, to, once they've nailed their colours to the mast, to really keep pushing. And so, at a global level, as an international corporation, you want that potential to sell or develop maybe in the future, and if we have to lose a few $1 million on the way, then that's okay. Right down to the personal, local level, where there's people whose reputations and careers are on the line, there's all sorts of reasons why companies continue to pursue projects that any straight-faced assessment will tell you this is going to lose money. It's going to lose money, and if it gets approved, it's going to cost all of you quite a lot in one way, shape or form. I'll leave it there. I look forward to some questions.
Thanks very much, Rob. And as a commissioned economist, you can disbelieve everything he just said. I'd like to introduce Tim Buckley, and Tim is the director for IEFA, and I won't try to say it again, for Australasia. So Tim analyses projects all over Southeast Asia. The latest one he did was a project in Bangladesh and looking at the Indian investment there. So without further ado, Tim.
Thank you. Just while Rod's loading up my presentation, I might start with an apology. I I've just flown down from Brisbane to be here tonight, and I unfortunately left my computer up at the office. I was looking at a Queensland coal project this afternoon, so I've just been quickly gathering my notes. So, Hume Coal, the Hume Coal proposal, to me, that is a stranded asset. Actually, before I go into Hume Coal, it might just be worth me giving a little bit of background on who am I and who IEFA is, just so you're familiar with that. I have 25 years financial markets experience. My last big role was with Citigroup. I was Managing Director, Head of Equity Research at Citigroup for 17 years. And I mention that not to establish that I have credentials in what at the time was the biggest bank in the world, and I have 25 years financial market analysis, analysing projects, corporates and strategies of companies, good and bad. And so I put that on the table so that you're aware of our background. And Rod, likewise, is an economist with a lot of experience, so we don't do this work lightly, and we bring a fair bit of experience. As to IEFA, IEFA is a public interest financial research house. We have offices around the world. We've got offices in America, Asia, India, Europe. We're opening 2 new offices next month in Asia. And so we have and are leveraging the international knowledge base of IEFA in the work we're bringing here to Australia. As Peter said, there's a distinct absence of transparency on Hume Coal at the moment. So what we've done is our best endeavours to examine from public information, all the available public information, and to analyse that and to critique the modelling for the Hume Coal project as the board of POSCO would be evaluating it. We've put together a report. We'd be very happy to debate with Hume Coal or POSCO any of the assumptions in there. We've put the full financial model in there. So if Hume Coal wants to debate it, we'd be very happy to do so. The numbers are all there. We're trying to be as transparent as possible. And as Peter says, when they eventually do come out with any information, we'd be happy to update our analysis and just debate it. So today, IEFA has, as Peter mentioned, released a report on Hume Coal. For those that are likely to read it, we have got some copies up the back. For the majority here, I'd expect you'd much prefer a one-page cheat sheet with the major points. So again, that's probably the easier way to read it. And the report is here, and it's also available online for anyone that wants to download it. So before I jump into Hume Coal specifically, I might just step back and touch on the coal sector in aggregate to set the scene and maybe bring, as Rod mentioned, a different approach to more a financial perspective. So if we just touch on the first slide, to me, the coal sector is absolutely structurally challenged. There has been a significant and sustained overestimation of demand across the coal sector globally. And one of the key international modelling agencies, the International Energy Agency, to maybe specifically reference the IEA, the International Energy Agency, they've been talking about Chinese demand continuing to grow for coal, for steel, for everything, and they've been talking about it peaking, China potentially peaking by 2030. Now, 2 years ago, 18 months ago, they put out 600-page reports analysing coal in enormous detail, and their best estimate was that China would peak coal potentially around 2030. Today, they've really reassessed that analysis, and they've walked away from it, and they now talk about it's quite likely that China actually has peaked its coal consumption, in fact, in 2013. They still talk about it possibly peaking by 2020. But just IEFA's perspective, we've been calling for the last 2 years, 3 years, that China actually is, in fact, past peak coal already. Now, that is a huge point of difference. It's very, very relevant for a number of factors, but let me just give you a couple of data points on coal in China so you can understand where I'm coming from. Chinese coal consumption for the first 12 years of this century was growing at 10% annually. So for 12 years in a row, coal consumption in China was growing at 10% per annum. Now, why do I pick on China? China is half the world's coal production and half the world's coal consumption. In 2014, something dramatic changed, and that is coal consumption in China declined by 2.9%. Now, everyone at the time in the finance industry and the coal industry, that's just an aberration, it's a one-off. 2015, coal consumption declined by 4%. Okay, it's not an aberration, it's not a one-off when it happens 2 years in a row. And the decline is accelerating. 2016, we've only got the first 6 months data, so these are straight off the Chinese government Bureau of Statistics. Chinese coal production year to date is down 9.7%. 9.7%. Now, that's production, not consumption, but China is 95% self-sufficient in coal. So if their production is down almost 10%, our best estimate is consumption is down more than 5%, and it'll be interesting to see how much more than 5%. But I give you that context to say there is a fundamental and structural change in the global coal industry. China is the biggest player by a country mile. It's 3 times bigger than America, 4 times bigger than India, 4 times bigger than Australia, and coal consumption and production peaked 3 years ago and is in decline. Now, within that context, Australia is an exporter of coal, and this project is for export purposes. Chinese imports of coal in 2014 declined by 10%. In 2015, imports of coal into China, the biggest importer in the world at the time, declined by 30%. So it's a little bit of background detail. It might seem a little off topic on Hume coal, but I just wanted to set the scene, partly because there's one number that stands out in the first 6 months of 2016 from China, and that is coal imports have actually increased. Bearing in mind, for every tonne of coal that China imports, they produce 15 tonnes of their own coal. China has been dramatically shifting their economy away from coal. The leadership of China has been systematically bringing in policy after policy to move their economy away from coal. Now, that policy involved a move to a 5-day working week from a 7-day working week about 5 months ago, and that meant domestic production has gone into free fall. In fact, in the June 2016 month, production was down 15% year on year. So I mentioned all of that. The coal price in the last 3, 4, 5 months, the internationally traded coal price has rallied quite aggressively and unexpectedly. It had been in free fall, as Rod mentioned. I mean, it peaked 5 years ago. The coking coal price peaked at $330 a tonne. It got down to about $80 a tonne at the start of this year. It has rallied up north of $100 a tonne just in the last couple of months. I put that in the context of it's still down 60% over the last 5 years. And the reason it's rallied is China is cutting their coal consumption and production so dramatically. The seaborne market is a bit of a rounding error. And so to me, there's a bit of an aberration just in the last couple of months as to why coal prices have rallied. And so certainly in IEFA's view, it is very much a temporary phenomenon. There is an underlying structural decline in the coal industry. And if we shift to the third chart, if I could. My background, as I mentioned, 25 years in the financial market. So I look at the financial markets as a pretty clear indicator of structural change. So what this chart is it's the share price chart over a 5-year period. You don't have to worry about the numbers. You can see the lines. All 4 lines that are going down are the share prices over the last 5 years of the largest pure play listed companies in Australia in the coal sector. So we have seen a bit of a bounce in the last 3-4 months. I'd put it in the context, something like Whitehaven is still down more than 70% in the last 5 years. The red line, the top line, is the stock exchange, the overall market index. It's up 20-30% in the same time frame. So coal is dramatically underperforming the stock market. The best performing stock on that list is Whitehaven. It's only down 70% in a market up 30%. So coal mining companies are proving to be an absolute wealth hazard, and the wealth destruction in this sector in Australia is pretty dramatic. The wealth destruction by comparison in America is even more so. In fact, almost every major listed coal company in America is now in Chapter 11. The wealth destruction, market capitalisation destruction in the last 5 years is north of $40 billion. And it's worth bearing in mind, I'll stay on that chart. It's worth bearing in mind that the lowest share price performer is Wollongong Coal. I mentioned that, it stands out there, it's down 99.9% in the last 5 years. It's in absolute financial distress. It's worth bearing in mind it runs, or used to run, 2 underground coking coal mines, along the lines of what Hume Coal's proposing to build. Now, both those 2 mines are now in care and maintenance. They can't make money. The corporate is in absolute financial distress, and the share price speaks, in my view, for itself. You don't lose 99% of your value without something being fundamentally wrong. So to move on to Hume Coal, we've done a financial analysis of the mine proposal. And what we've done in our analysis, because of the absence of detailed financial information from POSCO on Hume Coal, we've compared it to South 32's Illawarra Coking Coal division. So that's a public listed company. It operates in this region 3 underground coking coal mines, and it produces 7 or 8 million tonnes of coking coal per annum. So we've used the numbers from South 32 to benchmark against the Hume Coal. I would actually put that is a very conservative basis to actually do it from, because South 32's coking coal operation has cut its cost by about 18% in the last 18 months alone. We've given Hume Coal the assumption that they can actually deliver the same sort of low-cost operation that South 32's operating, despite the fact they'll be producing an average of 2 million tonnes rather than Illawarra Coal's 7 to 8 million tonnes. Our analysis says that Hume Coal will lose money with every tonne of coal that they produce. So, very similar conclusion to what Rod said. This proposal is a proposal. The probability of it going ahead when the POSCO board sees that the numbers are that they're going to lose money with every tonne, the probability is they're just going to defer and wait. And our net present value analysis, which is fully detailed in the report, our net present value on this $940 million CapEx program is minus $384 million. So no board's going to approve a deal that a greenfields development that's high risk and delivers a negative net present value of this sort of order of magnitude. As an alternative benchmark, it's Peabody Energy reported this week. Now, Peabody Energy is in Chapter 11. It's destroyed $18 billion of shareholder wealth in the last 5 years. I mentioned Peabody because they reported their coking coal division of Australia lost over $120 million cash on their coking coal division in Australia just in the last 12 months. So I mention that because if I use them as a comparison, a benchmark for the Hume Coal, our NPV would be dramatically more negative. The cash losses would be double what we're forecasting they'll be. And so, again, I'd throw that out there. That is one benchmark that would suggest we've been extremely conservative in our analysis. A few parameters on Hume Coal. Firstly, in their preliminary environmental assessment, they talk about peak coal and peak employment. So I'll just put that in perspective. They talk about peak production of up to 3 million tonnes per annum if this proposal goes ahead. Over the life of the mine, as Rod actually showed earlier, the project will average 2 million tonnes of coal per annum. Likewise, they mentioned that peak employment, operating employment for the proposal is up to 300 jobs over the 19-year life of the project. Our analysis says the number's going to be south of 200 jobs over the life of the analysis, purely because the peak is 300, the average is a very, very different number. We can talk peaks, we can talk averages, and the average number is less than 200. Actually, in our analysis, we come up with a number of about 160 jobs direct. There will be some indirect jobs, obviously, at the port and at the railway, which will get you back up potentially to 200 on average over the life of the mine. The third number I'll pull out of our report was that Rod mentioned that POSCO is proposing to Australia a unique mining technique called pine feathering. What that means is it's relatively environmentally friendly relative to other coal mines. Obviously a big caveat there about relative. But one of the key aspects of that means that they're only going to recover 35% of the coal resource. Now that dramatically erodes any viability of the project if you're leaving 2/3 of the coal in situ. And that dramatically impedes the ability to actually realise economies of scale that Illawarra Coal's getting with their longwall mining. So again, I'd mentioned we've used Illawarra Coal as the benchmark. I would suggest we've been very conservative on that. Our conclusion is that when the POSCO board eventually goes to evaluate whether or not they should proceed with this proposal to spend 940 million Aussie dollars to build this project, or 700 million US dollars, they're going to look at the alternatives. Okay, they're a steel company. They are looking at a vertical integration strategy, so therefore they're going to be using coking coal. They don't, as Rod said, have to source that coking coal from here. They can source it from anywhere. They could sign a long-term offtake agreement with a coal company that's in financial distress. No, pick a coal company that's not in financial distress. So they all need the offtake agreement. But there's an alternative one, and I think it's a really interesting benchmark. Last month, it was reported in the Financial Review. It was reported in the Financial Review that BHP has bid, and it's only a report, a rumour, that they've bid $1 billion US to buy 2 coking coal mines in Queensland from Anglo American. So Anglo American's yet another mining company in financial distress. They're looking to sell their Australian operations, in fact most of their global operations, and they've proposed selling 2 coking coal mines. Between them they produce more than 10 million tonnes of coking coal. So why do I mention that? If BHP's bidding $1 billion for 10 million tonnes per annum of capacity, that equates to about $100 million US per million tonne. Hume Coal's proposal is for $350 million per million tonne of capacity. So in other words, you could go out, POSCO could go out, joint venture with BHP and buy those 2 Anglo-American projects at 1/3 of the value at which they're proposing to build Hume Coal at. Now, no board in their right mind is going to take all the risk of a greenfield development with all the community opposition, with all the variability in that proposal, when they could go out and buy an existing operation at 1/3 of the price. So I might leave it there, and as Rod mentioned, we'd be very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. Now, we've got 2 microphones, one on each side. The idea is if people want to, rather than hand them around, if people want to ask a question, perhaps you could line up behind the microphone, and I think we've got to turn the mics on, and we'll take questions for Tim and Rod. So if you wouldn't mind, if you want to ask a question, I'm sure there's plenty. We'll get some people to start. Would you walk up to the microphone, please? I think we'll need to make sure it's turned on, which it isn't at this stage.
Oh, I've got a pretty loud voice. Sort of figured out that if it wasn't going to be the economic viability of the project was never going to happen. What's the exit strategy for POSCO? How do we let them go out gracefully? We just heard that the New South Wales government is buying out the licences on Liverpool plants. Is there a similar strategy we could employ to let them, if there's no way they're going to make money, I suppose they need a way to leave with maybe something.
Look, I think that's an absolutely spot on question. And unfortunately, the way our planning system is set up, it doesn't really provide that. And you know, I think partly there is not much of a graceful exit option is part of the reason why is the same reason why a lot of economic assessments of coal mines for so long went unquestioned, because for most of the last 15 years, they were going to make a mozza and they were going to go ahead. And so we've got this amazing lobbying and planning infrastructure, or lobbying and planning systems and organisations set up to approve and to commence coal mines. And so I think what we're finding in the last couple of years, where suddenly the boom has turned to bust, is all those lobbyists and bureaucrats who were set up to do that and spend a lot of time very publicly saying that they thought this was always a fabulous idea, it's pretty hard for them to get off that horse. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's hard to provide a graceful exit. And that's why I think the EIS process is so important here. So the environmental impact statement and the planning process at this point is because there is no approval at this point. And I think if approval is denied, then that does give, if not a graceful out, certainly a pretty clear point of this hasn't been approved. Any sort of resubmission and reapplication is very unlikely and long and expensive. Sorry, it's a very long answer to what was a really good question. I think the best way forward is to really focus on the planning system and this EIS process, and try and ensure that no planning approval is given, which gives a pretty clear signal to the company that it's time to draw stumps. But Tim knows a lot more about how companies actually work than I do.
Yeah, at the risk of prolonging a detailed answer on the question, I think it's a really important question. It is exactly as Rod said, in POSCO's interest just to delay and defer a decision, because whilst they still have the resource, whilst they still have the proposal in front of them, it gives them optionality. No one knows where the coal price is going to be in 5, 10, 15 years' time, so they could just defer. They know they'll lose money today, but who knows in 5 years' time. So the worst case scenario is that we actually just get no decision and it just gets dragged on. I would mention I think the Karuna announcement today is a really interesting one. If the New South Wales government is spending money to buy back a licence from BHP, it begs the question, what else are they going to buy back? Obviously, Shenhua would be looking at that announcement with enormous degree of interest. It's worth bearing in mind in Queensland, the Queensland government has taken a little more aggressive stance on coal mining recently. Just in the last 6 months, they've introduced a policy of use it or lose it. So they're getting back a lot of the exploration licences and development licences. If you don't use it, you're going to lose it. Now, the New South Wales government has been applying that logic in gas in the last 12 months, and maybe today's announcement suggests that they are looking at the same sort of program in coal. Now, there is compensation involved in this case with Karuna, but in Queensland it's use it or lose it, there's no compensation. So maybe that opens up some optionality for the New South Wales government to actually take action to bring it to a head and resolve it.
Do you want to MC?
Next question, please.
Please excuse my ignorance about the current situation in Highlands. But I collect my child from Oxley College each weekday, and I sit by the railway line. And I do see characters going past that appear to be carrying coal. Is that right? Is coal currently being mined in the Highlands to any extent?
Yeah, there is, I don't know all of the mines around this area, but Illawarra Coal has 3 mines in this area. They're closer to the coast. Tarmore is still mining, although Glencore has just announced 2 months ago that mine will probably close in the next couple of months. I mentioned Wollongong Coal has 2 mines in Wollongong. They've been in care and maintenance for the last 12 months. They can't make money out of them. But
So that's the coal that's being transported through Barrel.
I don't know specifically the coal in that's going down the Barrel line.
I think there is coal coming from Tarmore down
Right.
that line through Mossvale.
Thank you. So it's definitely black. I had hoped that it was cement, but it did look like that.
Yeah, or Tarmore is definitely producing at the moment, but 2 months ago Glencore announced they are proposing to close the mine in the next couple of months.
Where would it be going south? What destination would Tarmore go through Burrowville?
It goes down to Port Kembla, down the escarpment, down to Port Kembla.
Comes back in Moscow.
Yes, from up north. That's correct. Look, that's an interesting point about Tarmore closing. The announcement was that they are going to lay off up to 300 miners. It's going to happen between now and 2019. That's a longwall coal mine that's been operating for many years, much more efficient than this proposal. And I think it brings up the whole point, why would you close down an operating coal mine where I don't know how many billions of dollars have been expended up there, the equipment and machinery is already operating, it's in place, and they're going to close it down because they can't make the economics work. Xstrata, which is owned by Glencore, is one of the biggest coal miners in the world. They can't make that one work. What makes POSCO think they can make a brand new one down here work at much greater cost? And I think that's a really important point.
So you might not be seeing those coal trains for too much longer, would be.
It's just like Q&A, isn't it? There's the silver fox up here hosting the rest of the panel. Move to our next question.
I hate economists.
I just and you gentlemen have presented some very interesting information tonight. And I'm a little bit more forceful than the last gentleman was here. I'd like to push heating coal out. I don't want to see, at a personal level, coal mining in this area. I think for all the jobs they claim they can create, we'd lose jobs in tourism and providing accommodation and all string of things here that would bugger up this area. And what I'm wondering is, how do we forcefully take the information that you're giving us, the government, so that we give somebody a bit of a kick along and get this fixed up?
Another great question. And just on the point of jobs impacts on other industries, as Peter said, we're continuing our assessment. We've conducted a lot of interviews with local businesses, and so we'll be doing more work on likely jobs impacts. And as I've sort of concluded at the end, you don't encourage mining to create jobs. So I think you're absolutely right there. How do you take this message to government? The EIS process is very important, and so lots of submissions to that process and a big turnout at PAC meetings. When an EIS comes out, that's when I think communities really need to be united and active and putting in lots of submissions. But I think it's important to note that this is a special case down here where a community is on the front foot and is already taking that message to government as much as possible. And the fact that there's functions like this, there's some media here, there's a lot of people talking about it. This is really quite special. It's an organised community that's been very well led by some great people, including Peter. even Peter, in the local groups here. But you know, there's always plenty you can do. Letters to editors, letters to your local members, calling Alan Jones, talking to your neighbours, putting up a sign on the front gate. All of these things make a difference. And when, as an outsider who goes to lots of coal and gas regions, you drive into this area and you start seeing the water not coal signs in densities that are not seen anywhere else. And it sends a very strong message that there's a lot of unhappy people about this down here. So how do you do it? All of these things, I would say, keep doing it. You've got a local election coming up. There's any number of opportunities to emphasise your feelings to your potential representatives. There's even some here tonight.
Can I say a few words? Can I ask a question?
No. Tim wants to...
Sorry, I might just, before you do, if I could just add to Rod's answer. I mean, to my thinking, the Department of Planning in Australia and New South Wales should be renamed the Department of Approvals for mine approvals. I mean, it might sound a cheap shot, and Rod's put a lot more work in this area than I have, but the department doesn't actually evaluate mines. They promote mines. And every time you go to a PAC meeting and you see the PAC and you see it's overwhelmingly against the proposal, the PAC recommends against the project, and the New South Wales government gives it back to the state planning department, and then they resubmit the approval or change the law and then resubmit the approval. So I think it's about time Australia realises coal is in structural decline. Our state governments, our federal government need to understand that point and realise that we are one of the biggest suppliers in the world. We're the second biggest exporter of thermal coal. We're the biggest exporter of coking coal. We are a price taker. The last thing we want to do is flood the market, if it's already in decline, with even more supply. That is not in Australia's national interest. We should be tightening supply and deferring new mine proposals until we see demand for it, and letting the price actually go back up so we get a viable return on an industry that is it's New South Wales' biggest export industry. We shouldn't be crushing it by oversupplying the market. So I think, to go to the question that was asked, we should all be talking to all of our local members, our state members, our federal members, and calling them to account.
Yep, voice as well. Thank you very much, gentlemen, tonight. Look, my question, basically, just from what you've said, Rob, is about the whole issue. Here we are gathered here tonight. I've got a brother and a sister-in-law that's standing up in Bulga. I'm just wondering if you represented Bulga, because basically they had two wins in the courts, just like we have had here. Basically, the state government went back, changed the legislation. Bulga is going to suffer from an open-cut coal mine right on its doorstep. So even though the people have gone out there, they've lobbied hard in their community, the state government has gone back and let Rio Tinto apply and apply again. So basically, even though the community, like here, have opposed it, the state government has overruled it and gone back because there's money involved. Now, you talked about why there's pride in this for those people that want to keep pushing for it, but the people in Bulga, my brother, I don't know if you saw him on the ABC the other night, and his wife have been fighting this for a long time. And when the highest court in the land says you've won your case, but the state government goes back on their word, what hope is there?
Yeah, I'm very familiar with Bulga. I've been there a lot of times. Who's your brother?
Robert.
Rob? Yeah, I've stayed at Rob's place.
Oh, okay, there you go.
You stayed his place tonight.
Yeah, look, I think Bulga is a tragedy of a story, and you know, I know a lot of those people personally as well, and yeah, I'm feeling pretty disheartened by some of that.
What I'd ask is, where are our state members? It's all right having a local government here, and as Larry said, you know, who you want to vote for, but we are the consent authority. We should have our local members here. If you want to make an objection, it's got to be for your state members.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think there's a lot more reason for optimism here than in Bulga at this point. This never happened in Bulga. Bulga's big win, you know, came later. There was a lot of trust put in the process, in the planning department, much earlier. You know, there was a lot. You know, Bulga really played by the rules, and not to suggest any illegality. The community here aren't playing by the usual rules and sitting back and waiting for it to happen. You're here tonight. You've already got a water study. You've got a financier, an economist here. We're both pretty well known in planning and resource circles. So I think there's much more reason for optimism here than a mine that did already exist. As much as I didn't want it to expand, the mine was already there. And all those incentives I talked about for why a company would pursue a project that's not particularly viable, I think this is abundantly unviable. The Warkworth project was marginal. And so I think all of those factors I mentioned were much, much greater for a serious mining company with a major project there, rather than a steel company with a vague interest in a small amount of supply sometime in the future. So I'd be far more optimistic here than Bulga, but I feel, I definitely feel for Robin and Marie and the Crays, and I spoke to Judith Leslie today.
So it's gone, hasn't it?
Well, you never say never, and I hope to get up there soon. The other thing I'd point out is Tim talked a little bit about the planning department and the problems with planning. I think planning rightfully takes a lot of the blame for a lot of these problems. It's actually, but I look at planning as being generally poorly resourced and lent on. The actual problem is the division of resources and energy, which is a different department within trade and investment and within Premier and Cabinet. That is essentially the coal industry within the department, and Australia Institute will be releasing a study in the coming months on the attitudes of the DRE on different forms of energy. They're meant to advocate for all forms of energy. Really, when you look at their submissions to the planning process, they're an outpost of the coal industry. So in terms of what can you do and what should you be doing, yes, writing to your local members, yes, making planning submissions, but highlighting the problems and the mistakes that the division of resources and energy have made and how unreliable they've been. I'd love to see some more public pressure on the division of resources and energy.
Before I turn over to Kathy, I'd just like to say that we do spend an enormous amount of time talking to the Department of Resources and Energy and planning, etc. And it is an intense lobbying exercise, and we've gone out intentionally to tip the whole system on its head. We went out intentionally to tip the whole land access system on its head, and I think we've succeeded with the big win recently in the Court of Appeal. It cost a lot of money, but we've actually totally tipped the land access system for mining on its head in New South Wales. People cannot get onto And in planning, we're intending to do exactly the same thing. We've said to the Premier, the Planning Minister, Anthony Roberts, the Head of Resource and Energy, this whole process is a crock. It doesn't work. It's totally biased against communities, the environment, landowners. It's biased totally towards coal miners and resource developers, and it's got to stop. And we're going to stop it because we're going to... If it gives you any confidence at all, believe me, they are listening. Now, I'm not saying they're listening and they're moving rapidly, but this BHP thing is so significant. They've been signalling these buyouts or buybacks for some time, and we were sort of waiting to see how quickly they'd move and how much they'd spend and so on. And this is a very significant signal. This says they want out of a lot of these greenfield coal projects. The expansions, I mean, Graham mentioned his brother and sister. Kim and I were at the Bulga thing on the Domain the other day. I was talking to those people, and it is a really very sad story. But they've been caught with an expansion project, and they're the hardest to knock off. This is a greenfields. I think most of the greenfields projects in New South Wales are not going to go ahead. Now, that's a brave statement. I think we'll look back in 5 or 6 years and we'll see most of them, if not all of them, get knocked on the head. Because I think the other thing to think about, what drives a government to want to approve one of these things? Economics. If they see the royalty stream going out in front of their eyes way into the future because of uncertainty of development, why would you put your political career on approving coal mines when you're not going to get any financial benefit in your political lifetime from that particular project or set of projects? You're not going to do it. And that's what's dawning on these people in this parliament, both federal and state, that royalties are going way into the future. God, we'd be better developing solar plants and wind farms and all other things where the royalties are up front. So they are driven by very selfish short-term interests, and the economics are working in our favour. So that's just one thing before I turn over to Kathy for another question.
Woo. That's a big, hard act to follow. What I would like to say is, there seems to me to be no revelation to the public of actually how much money does the government pick up out of every tonne of coal that's being mined. Now, I know there's a royalty that's being paid, and that's a figure. However, the real costs of the planning departments, all these departments you mentioned a few minutes ago, land and environment court, the amount of times things have to go before courts, the cost to the public purse for providing all these activities, fighting to stop coal mining, it just is such a no-brainer. Now, does the government actually make money out of coal today at the price at which it's being developed or being mined today and being sold? I would really like to hear that figure if possible.
Great question. I probably can't give you an instant figure, but I can give you a few that might come close. Let's take this as a pop quiz. Does anyone know what percentage of New South Wales revenue, state government revenue comes from coal royalties? Any guesses?
0.5%?
No, it's more than that. So it's just under 2%. So 98% of your hospitals and schools and roads are not paid for by the coal industry. And you raise an absolutely valid point that an awful lot of state government expenditure goes to benefit the coal industry. I wrote an assessment. Me and a colleague went through all these state government budget papers for every state for 6 years a couple of years ago, and our estimate was that about $18 billion had been spent on projects that largely, sometimes exclusively, and sometimes largely benefited the mining and gas industry. New South Wales, I think, was at the lower end of that. I think it was about 800 million over 6 years. So but that doesn't include some of those courts and other costs that you raise, and it certainly doesn't include the costs of you all having to sit here and talk about economics on a Thursday or on a Thursday night. So yeah, you're absolutely right that there's enormous costs that don't come into that. In financial terms, yes, New South Wales does make a small amount of revenue out of the coal industry. But I can talk about this at length, so if you want to, we'll go to more questions.
Robert, just wondering if you've done any economic modelling on the environmental safeguards that you hold need to teach to make this economically viable?
Yeah, so absolutely, and this comes to the crux of our assessment. You absolutely hit the nail on the head of here is a completely unviable proposal that could be made more viable by shifting more of the cost onto the environment and the community and off the private proponent. So, make more costs public and less private. And I think another outcome that I fear here, so yeah, there are some estimates in there. I think we've got a figure on what percentage reduction in operating costs would be required to see the project be viable for the proponent. I can't remember, I think it was about a 27 or 30, high 20% reduction in operating costs and a bit of a bump in the coal price could see that happen. So yeah, there is some assessment in there. And I think that's another risk that needs to be pointed out, that Hume apply for approval of this pine feather mining technique, this relatively benign technique, and then once you've got your initial approval from planning, it's much easier to go back and say, oh, we just need this tiny modification to our approval. We just need to stick a long wall or something in here, and then we can bring in the jobs and the royalties. So your point is a good one. Yes, there is some assessment in there. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head.
Do you want to answer that? It's very much in Rod's area rather than mine, but I mean, one of the ones which comes up is that POSCO's proposing to cover the rail wagons. So how do you reduce your costs? You don't cover the rail wagons. Does any other coal mining operation in Australia or the rest of the world cover coal wagons? No. So POSCO will most likely, if they operate like any other coal company in the world, will go back to the government after they've got approval and just say, we can't afford to cover the coal wagons. It's just an extra cost. Now, it's probably only $50 cents a tonne or whatever, but that's, as Rod said, a way of externalising the cost. So the Wollongong community and anyone living along the railway line, anyone actually using the water between here and Wollongong or Port Kembla Coal Terminal will have coal dust for the next 19 years as a result of it. So that externalises air pollution, asthma, cancer, and all the health costs straight back onto us, the community. Another example of that, and I'm reminded, is that the state governments have provided the railway system. So that is public money, and the amount of losses from the railway lines that operate, I don't have any figures because they're not available for the Illawarra area, but for the Hunter Valley Coal Network, that's a federal government asset in inverted commas, that loses money every year. So that is a straight out subsidy by all of us in Australia to the coal industry. The government provides the infrastructure and doesn't get a viable return on it. That is money that they could have actually put into police, hospitals and so on. So to me, the earlier question from the lady before Kate was spot on. It's very hard to quantify because the government doesn't provide the information. The only number you can get is the benefit, the dollars of royalty, and what you can see, as Rod said, in every state government budget is that the royalties are always way lower than what the government had forecast they would be.
So again, thank you, Rob.
Not sure if you're on.
Tim, am I on?
Get closer.
Am I?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you again. We had the question that was raised before about influencing politicians. Is that better? It's not on. All right, I'll yell. So the question that that was posed earlier about influencing politicians. I know that Peter herself has sat down with a number of politicians, and they are listening. We had Graham talking before, but I was previously on the board of the SCA, the Sydney Catchment Authority, and I can tell you that not only this state government, but the previous state government, were letting some pretty shonky stuff happen in those catchment areas as well. And when, as a stakeholder on that board, when the stakeholders started to explore and investigate into that, lo and behold, the stakeholders were told to go. So it was just miners having keys into catchment areas. But we had, speaking about politicians that are starting to come on board, we had a launch at Ranelagh House, or the Robertson Hotel, the other night. And what he labelled was, the mining boom is over, this is Stephen Jones, and what we're facing is a dining boom. Now, that's something that we're embracing here passionately, because in our strategic planning, in council and not the consent authority, as we've heard, but in our strategic planning, we're seeing the opportunity between Sydney and Canberra for this area to become a food basket. We've got a growing industry of food and wine culture, tourism and all those ancillary services that have been shown. Could I ask, the question is, could I ask if we've done a comparative cost, and I've seen the mining figures, but against what is at risk should our agricultural land and our aquifers are destroyed through this? What is the actual loss versus the gain from mining? Have we done those sort of figures?
So essentially that's what our report does, and comes to negative hundreds of millions of dollars. Or I guess in terms of what does the Southern Highlands community lose, it's that big unknown of how hard do you hit the aquifer, what is that worth, what value do you put on water pollution and air pollution and having to change your railway configurations. So, it's a really hard exercise to do in detail, and I feel like when you're already in the can to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, there's maybe not too much point in going out and measuring every litre of water. So, have the numbers been done? Yeah, they've been done here, and I'll sign it up.
Now, where do you buy this? So,
in terms of the reports, they'll be available publicly, so you can actually, for $20, if you want, we've only got 30 copies of each printed or available tonight. For $20, you can have one of each. You've obviously got your summary. Most people, that's great bedtime reading, that'll put you to sleep. It was written by an economist.
Not the crowd here.
Not this crowd. We'll be publishing that. It'll be up on our website, so you can get an electronic copy, and we'll have more printed down the track. So it'll be freely available. We'll send it to Hume Coal. We'll ask them to tell us why this is all wrong and not relevant to their situation, as I think they've been telling the media in the last few days without even knowing what the study says. But they're more than welcome to critique it and give us their information if they think it's substantially different. So we will, I think at that point I should wrap it up. It's getting late.
Maybe we can let them throw that challenge to you, Cole, maybe to answer some of these questions. So thank you. And remember those dining booth that we're facing, and we embrace that.
Last question then.
Michael, we've got one more question.
Just one quick question. Does your economic modelling take into account the environmental levy or bond that the mining companies have to put up for those events?
So the question is, have we included the environmental bond that needs to be put up?
I only asked that.
That's a great question.
We've been trying to ascertain what that figure
Yeah.
Very unsuccessful from the government.
So my sort of squirming answer would be, I would argue, and I think most coal industry economists would argue the same thing, that we've included that within our operating costs. But I think your point is a great one, that's a figure that should be robustly and transparently assessed and transparently published. And
You might have read last week that the Queensland government's been caught out by $3.5 billion shortfall in environmental levies and environmental degradation.
yeah, I think Tim has plenty to say on that topic.
Yeah, I can mention our analysis includes a figure, an estimate, a guesstimate of $30 million for the rehabilitation bond. It'll be financial assurance. I would point out that in this particular case, underground mines, the rehabilitation bonds are relatively small. The amount of rehabilitation required is relatively low. You normally just shut them, close them, and hope you don't get too much subsidence. In Hume's case, to be fair to them, and it goes back to the earlier comment, Hume Coal has proposed to take all of the coal waste and use it in a slurry form and put it back down the coal mines. So they are proposing to backfill to avoid subsidence. I think there are some geological problems with that, but nevertheless, that is a positive endorsement of their project relative to a lot of other mines where they just close the door and hope you don't get subsidence. But what you refer to is very much to me yet another example of an externality that the coal mining industry is very happy to pass to all of us, the Australians, the voters, the taxpayers. As you mentioned, to me, the Queensland study, well, it was actually a departmental memo or report released, it fell off the back of a truck. The ABC wrote it up extensively. As you said, the conclusion of that report was that for coal mining alone in Queensland, the government financial assurance is short by a minimum of $3 billion. $3 billion, and that's on the assurance levels that the government's modelling shows. Our numbers suggest that modelling is extremely conservative. The number's probably out by a factor of 3, so the number it's out by $10 billion would be our best guess. And that's for Queensland coal mining alone. So to me, that is just another example. Rehabilitation is very much another example of an externality that the coal industry throws back on us, the taxpayers. So I'll finish with one closing comment which steps back from that and say rehabilitation is an externality, it is a subsidy to the coal industry. To me, one of the key takeaways we should all have is that there is a systematic link between the governments of Australia and the coal mining industry. It is absolutely immoral, and to me, we need to absolutely stop the revolving door between the mining industry and the governments, the state governments and the federal governments. And it's been in the press, I've just come from Queensland, that Michael Roche, the head of the Queensland Resources Council, is retiring, and now we're asked, well, the AFR has been publishing for the last week gossip columns speculating which government minister is actually going to succeed Michael Roche as head of the Queensland Resources Council. Now, I'm just quoting straight out of the Fin Review that 2 state ministers, federal ministers have put their hand up. They would like the $500,000 a year lobbyist job that Michael Roche currently has. And to me, it is absolutely immoral that our government ministers can go from regulating the industry, take 2 months holiday, and then walk into a $500,000 a year job. It is immoral. It should be stopped.
That was a fantastic session. I think you'll all agree, from 2 very high quality, one an economist and one an analyst. No, that was fantastic, and we really appreciate the effort they've put in to these studies. Believe me, the amount we had to pay for the Australia Institute to do this was a fraction of the effort and the time that they expended. And of course, this guy came for nothing.
You got better value for money.
Better value. I think it was really insightful, and you know, how can you argue with facts? And I think that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with facts. We're not dealing with fancy. We're not made. These guys aren't making it up. We need to get out there and we need to say to the state government, this is a crazy proposal, and these guys need to be told it's a crazy proposal and it won't be approved. And that's what we're saying from the Premier on down. And I actually think we're going to get some traction with that. Now, how long it takes is the big issue. We've got to close this off sooner rather than later, so we don't have to spend Thursday nights banging our gums in Mossvale. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you. One other thing, on Thursday the 25th of August, sorry, before you leave, on the Thursday the 25th of August at 4:30 in State Parliament, the Battle for Berrima petition, they got 15,000 people to sign a petition, is being debated in Parliament. So if you want to go along and give it your rev, it's Thursday 25th of August at 4:30 in State Parliament. Thank you.
Nice to meet you. How are you? Yeah, I'm Mark's brother. I didn't realise, I wasn't a dietitian, but I know, he's been battling for many years up there. I know he's always been rather long to me, so I bring up taking his one there. Who? Where have you been from? Yeah, good. He did really well. I enjoyed it. That's a little That's why I want to go first. Looking at his brothers out. Yeah. You got a baby right, don't you? You know him. It's a small world.